While we would have preferred to be with you in Ljubljana, we're very happy to be here with you at Ecsite Online as we bring you the Fred Kavli keynote lecture by Nicolas Nova. We believe that science leads us to a future beyond the capabilities of our imagination. As our founder Fred Kavli said, the future will be more spectacular than we can ever imagine. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't try to envision it, as today's speaker will attest, as he helps us to speculate the near future possibilities for societal and technological change. Now, the science that the Kavli Foundation supports pushes forth the limits of our understanding that we have of the universe, our world, and ourselves as we explore the big, astrophysics, the small, nanoscience, and the complex, neuroscience. The Kavli Foundation has endowed research institutes around the globe, including in Europe, and plays a leading role in major initiatives such as the International Brain Initiative. The foundation is also a founding partner, along with Norway, of the $1 Million Kavli Prizes, which recognize scientists for their seminal advances in these fields and to promote public understanding of scientists and their work.
In addition to our commitment to supporting and honoring science, as Eric just described, we're also committed to strengthening the relationship between science and people. As we've shared with many of you over coffee at conferences or late night Ecsite parties, we're especially appreciative and supportive of those of you who nurture this relationship, especially now. Your work to bring people into science and share the wonder and the contents and especially the power of science with everyone is more important than ever. We can't wait for a future where we can get together again and see you again. And here to give us some insight into how to think about our future is Nicolas Nova. As Eric said, at the Kavli Foundation, we support science that pushes the frontiers of our understanding of the universe and ourselves. So you can imagine how delighted we were when we heard Dr. Nova would be this year's keynote speaker. We expect him to push the frontiers of our understanding of ourselves today. Dr. Nova is a researcher, consultant, speaker, and educator. He's an anthropologist of technology who works in the field of interaction design, futures research, and digital cultures. He's been active in establishing design fiction, an approach to anticipate and speculate near future use of digital technologies. Dr. Nova has 2 PhDs, one in social sciences and one in human-computer interaction. He's both the co-founder of the Near Future Laboratory and associate professor at the Geneva School of Arts and Design. We can't wait to find a future and envision a future where we'll all be together again. Thank you, Dr. Nova, for being here, and over to you.
And I can see from my control screen that we are back. Thank you so much to the Kavli Foundation for supporting this session. And welcome to Nicolas Nova, who has joined us on the virtual stage for his lecture. Nicolas, first of all, how are you?
Doing well, sitting in my office. Thank you.
And whereabouts is your office, Nicolas? I'm
in Geneva, Switzerland, downtown Geneva, more precisely.
And how are things in Geneva right now?
Well, it's sunny today. It's good that we had a lot of rain in the past few days, so now it's back to summer.
Brilliant. Well, look, I'm so pleased that you can join us for today, and I think it's time to hand over to you to hear about the future. The stage is yours.
Cool. Thank you, Brad. All right. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, even though it means like looking at me with this big headset on my face. That's the new normal we live in these days. So my intention this morning is to give you a kind of overview of the term design fiction as an approach to explore the near future. Some sort of futures research in the 3, 4, 10 years perspective. And my point is to show you this based on a lot of examples. I don't want to be too academic, to be too boring about that. And I use a lot of different projects and some like key insights about why we do that, the logic behind it, and what it means to do this in different contexts, because obviously I'm not working in a museum, but that could be useful for you guys. So first, a quick note about who I am. I am partly an academic in the Geneva School of Art and Design, but most of my time is devoted to design fiction with the Near Future Laboratory, a small agency that is based in Europe and in California, as you could see on the map. And what we do is to work with clients private companies, public institutions, on different projects about the future, helping them to map or understand change. And the change could be technological, could be societal, could be political, but most of the time it's about technologies because that's the core perspective we have. And what we try to do is to help them not anticipate the future, but plan for those changes that may happen in the future, planning for risks, opportunities, possibilities that could be done. And in general, what the clients ask us for is to help them reshape their perspective about how the future could be. And in order to do that, we, over the course of the last probably 13, 14 years or so, we came up with this notion of design fiction, a term that we use to refer to our approach that basically focuses on creating tangible evidence of possible near futures. It means practically that we're doing a bit like what happened in science fiction movie, where you see props, accessories, things that can show you that you are in the future, except that what we do is that we don't do the film, we just do the props and the accessories. So for instance, we worked with private companies such as IKEA on how digital technologies, networked objects, sensors, artificial intelligence could change the way we live in our domestic environment. And instead of using those terms, which are kind of scary and a bit abstract, what we do is basically to use the very standard kind of artifact that IKEA used to communicate what they do, is the catalog. And here it's just an example, but it's one of those artifacts that create somehow a sort of scenario about possibilities in the future, like what you have on the right. What happened when you have a bed that you can register to because it's connected. And it's a way to test this idea and show it in a more pragmatic way than having someone telling you, yeah, beds will be connected. And of course, as we do this, the point is not at all to say this is the future, and I don't necessarily want this to happen. It's just a way to have a debate about the possibilities of having, new technologies in our homes, and that the company may want to debate about whether it's necessary, relevant, desirable, or not. Another project example that can give you some understanding of what we do with design fiction is this project that we did with the state of Geneva and its Department of Mobility. It's a project in which we were tasked by the Department of Mobility to create a public debate in a local event about self-driving vehicles, autonomous vehicles, those self-driving cars that you may have heard about. And instead of saying, yeah, self-driving vehicles will change the city and we have to prepare for this, what we did was to create this foldable map that explains, that illustrates how the city would be adjusted and changed because of self-driving vehicles. And of course, it's not at all like a prediction. Again, it's just a way to create a dialogue, to spark a certain discussion about the feasibility, what it means practically for the urban structure, its consequences, and so on and so on. So those are two basic examples of how we create like those very, very basic kind of artifacts, catalogs, maps, as a way to illustrate and probably embed the notion of a scenario about the future into something that could be understandable by a lot of people, that they could relate to, that they could debate about the feasibility, the desirability, the problems it may lead to. So the question you might wonder about is, yeah, this is all good and nice, but how do you do that? What does it mean practically? Because you said that you cannot predict the future, and it's absolutely right. No one can predict the future. The point of this project is, again, if you remember, to create a dialogue and debate with the stakeholders of a project. Could be the citizens, could be the customers of a company, could be the general population. So what we do and how we do that in terms of approach, I'll illustrate it with another project that hopefully will give you more tangible sense about how we do that. So it's another project about, again, sorry, it's the topics we work on, technologies. So self-driving vehicles that I mentioned before, you certainly saw autonomous or self-driving vehicles in the media in the last few years because it's quite trendy. And in general, when it's presented to the public, it's like this, like what you see on this slide. You see like this sort of sleek and glossy kind of representation about the vehicles. You might notice that there's no human body in it, which is completely weird because obviously a self-driving vehicle, even though it's autonomous, it's supposedly used by humans. And this is the way it's communicated. So it's probably okay for car companies. But if you want to have a debate with society about whether this is a technology that may have an influence on our way of life, it's not enough. I mean, it's just the tip of the iceberg, so to say. So instead of doing this, we're more interested in creating a design fiction, an object that would help people to understand how in the near future, how us normal people will operate self-driving vehicles. So in order to do this, there are generally two phases. And the first one, of course, is a bit like tongue-in-cheek. It's a bit of a joke because one cannot observe the future. But it's the idea that if you want to probably think about potential scenarios about the future, you have to look about the existing component of this future. The technologies, the behavior, those things already exist. Self-driving vehicles exist for quite some time. So what we do in general in project is to spend some time on the field, like sociologists or anthropologists. I'm also an anthropologist. Spending some time on the field, observing technology and people, and also doing some kind of desk research about the material that is already being produced about those technologies and their usage. So let's say we work on this project about self-driving vehicle. One thing that we were interested in was spending time with people already using vehicles with autonomous functions. Like if you use a Tesla nowadays, you can have some kind of degree of autonomy with the vehicle. So it's interesting to ask questions to people about how they live with that, how they have a certain degrees of trust or distrust in the system, the problems they encountered. So it's really about like understanding the human perspective about an already existing technologies that it's only used by a limited number of people. It's also visiting test fields. Like here, this is a project that was done by La Poste, the post office company in Switzerland, with another kind of self-driving vehicle, which is a sort of shuttle. So we, of course, observe that, spending time with people to understand how they use it, why they use it, what it feels like to be in a vehicle with a certain degree of autonomy, and using that kind of knowledge later. I will get back to it. We were also interested in understanding how this kind of objects may change the environments. For instance, when you have driverless shuttles, like the one I presented before, you generally have signage in the environment, signs that tells you that a vehicle can show up automatically without making any noise. The infrastructure is reshaped. So it's about documenting all those different elements that could tell us a certain kind of direction about the possibilities of self-driving vehicle as a future scenario. As I mentioned, there's also plenty of work, plenty of academic research about this that was conducted probably in the last 20 years or so. So accumulating, digesting, understanding all those studies about how people interact, how people use self-driving vehicles was also a way for us to observe the future, to see like some potential possibilities about how people may interact with those technologies. So using this, I mean, this part, the first part probably takes like few weeks, of course, and sometimes few months. We use that material to build extrapolations, to speculate about whether some of the things we saw, a behavior, a certain technology, a problem, how this might change dramatically or might have a bigger influence in the future if it was more important. And for doing this, what we do in general, and that's where the design fiction logic comes into play, is that we select a type of object, an archetype of an object. What I call archetype is, for instance, the catalog, the map that I presented before. But in this context, in the context of this project, we chose another format, another archetype to describe and think about our scenarios about self-driving vehicles. We used, and it's written with really tiny letters, we use an archetype that is close to us, the manual. You know, manuals. We used to have manuals for all of the technological product we had. Over time, the manuals somehow disappeared, but they still exist. When you buy, for instance, a smartphone, you have a 10 pages document called the Quick Start Guide that tells you the most important steps to use your smartphone or the problems you may encounter. So that's the format we chose to, well, illustrate what it means to have a self-driving vehicle in the future. So what we did basically was to speculate about some of the signals, some of the insights we learned doing field research, doing desk research, discuss that in groups. Each of the groups had to choose one problem that we noticed in the exploratory phase. For instance, we noticed talking to people using self-driving vehicle that they had some kind of anxiety about the fact that the vehicle is autonomous. So if there's a problem, you really need to override the system and take back control. So that's one problem. Another problem is what happens if you leave something or someone in your self-driving vehicles, you give it to Uber or a taxi company, and you realize that you lost someone or something in the vehicle. What happens if there's an accident that you cannot control? So there are several problems like that. We picked 10 problems, and we asked each group made of designers, engineers, to, well, think about the possibilities, whether the problems could be solved, whether the problems could have a technological solution, could have like a design solution, there could be a service around it. And each of the groups prepared that kind of a one-pager document about this that would fit later on in a manual. So this is basically the sort of quick start guide / manual that we have, roughly speaking, after a day of workshopping, brainstorming together. As you can see, each of the page has a title: I'm lost mode, hail iOS. Those are the terms we use to exemplify, illustrate the scenarios about the interaction with the technology. For instance, if you're lost in the self-driving vehicle because you're not in control, so you're not necessarily where you are. So you need to understand where you are. So there's a mode in the vehicle. There could be a mode in the vehicle that tells you where you are. There could be like a profile selection. There could be system upgrade, etc., etc. So this is basically like after a few hours of work, what we have roughly that we translate into a proper design fiction format. And this was not a project done with Amazon, but we used Amazon as a sort of excuse to discuss the possibilities of self-driving vehicles. So this is the sort of object that we created based on the workshop and the exploration. A quick start guide, like tiny manual that explains in each of the page a problem and how a problem with self-driving vehicle could be solved. For instance, if there's an emergency and you need to take control back, there's a button, and the conditions about emergency are described in the text. But again, if you remember what I said at the beginning of my presentation, this is absolutely not a prediction. It might be totally different. But this is a scenario about a possible future in which we use those technologies. And it's far better in terms of like public debate or debate with project stakeholders to use this, in our experience, to use this as a way to test the problems, the desirabilities, the risks, the opportunities of self-driving vehicles using very concrete examples, illustration of the scenario like this, as opposed to saying, yeah, self-driving vehicles, it's the future, it's going to change everything from Austin, Texas to Marseille, which is totally wrong, because, I mean, we need to go into certain details and specificities to have a discussion about whether those things that we're talking about here are relevant for our society. So that's a quick definition about design fiction to reiterate what I said. So we do as if the future already existed. Like, for instance, self-driving vehicle exists, we do a manual. And it's a representation of future scenarios through fictional objects or products or services. And we do as if they already existed or occurred so that we can learn how to innovate or create new opportunities. And for doing this, we use like many different objects or media conventions. So we saw like maps, catalogs, a quick start guide. I'll show you an example with a fictional newspaper afterwards to express ideas about possible futures. And that's probably the most important logic, to test those ideas, to discuss them. We need them to be understandable by people in terms of communication, in terms of understanding. And the use of those standard objects is quite convenient for that. So at this point, I will probably take a step back and say a few things about where this comes from. We're not the only groups of people doing that. There are many others. And of course, it was inspired by a lot of different things and a lot of different cultural phenomena. So if you're interested in science fiction, obviously, you may realize that what I've presented as science fiction as an ancestor. If you look at science fiction movies, science fiction books, comic books, you see plenty of objects, artifacts that show you that you are in the future, that things are a bit different. For instance, if you watch Star Trek, you saw the communicator that Mr. Spock is using here, this kind of telecommunication device that was presented in Star Trek in 1978. And that was so inspiring for some engineers working at Motorola that they created the mobile phone, inspired by that. So this is an interesting example because it shows how science fiction somehow works hand in hand with designers and engineers. It's not necessarily in the same way as what I've presented. It's not about creating a debate. It's just about putting people, the viewers, us, into a possible future that make us, well, love or hate scenarios about it. So that's one case. I mean, if you watch TV shows like Black Mirror recently, it's exactly about that as well. Another ancestor to design fiction that I think is important to mention as well is that I mean, it's been a long time that institutions, could be private companies or public institutions, created objects to make people understand how the future could be. In world fairs, there's a lot of that in general. And if you look, for instance, at the Futurama, which was a building by General Motors, the American car company, at the World Fair in New York in 1939, there was this big building that you see on the left with people making a long line to go into the building. And when they were in the building, they could sit and observe some kind of mock-up, some kind of like representation of the city of the future with skyscrapers and cars and freeways, and people could understand the way the future could be. Of course, I mean, as you can imagine, especially nowadays where we have some kind of critical perspective on cars, as you can imagine, this was done also to influence people in a good way, to understand that the future is about cars and they need to buy a new car. People were making the line, as you can see on the left, and when they exited the building, they got a badge saying, "I saw the future." So it's another ancestor, but perhaps a bit less, well, certainly less critical than what I've presented at the beginning of my intervention. It's more here about how certain companies try to influence people with positive representations about the futures. Of course, these positive representations about the futures were not liked or enjoyed by everyone, and there was an important wave of projects in architecture, in design, in art in the 60s that somehow took the same kind of approach, creating objects, visualization, representation about possible futures to show a critique about society, to show a new set of possibilities. So that's another ancestor to design fiction. It's the field of critical architecture and design from the 60s, where you had like groups and collectives, like here, this one is called Archigram. It's based in the UK, but there were also I mean, most of the European countries had like groups like that, and they created different representation of possible futures, which were completely strange. There were architects who did not build buildings, but did this kind of representations in exhibits, in booklets, in comic books. This is a walking city. It's called the walking city. They imagine how city could move in the future and be totally different than the representations of cities from General Motors that we saw before. And this, of course, led to participated in the general critique about society in the 60s, but it had a very important influence on another ancestor to design fiction, which is called speculative design. I guess, I mean, in general, when people talk about design, what comes to mind is like those really nice chairs and tables or interior architecture that fancy people like. Design is a much broader field in the context of applied art. And in this context, there's been, in the last 30 years, like a group of designers, especially around Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby in the UK, but there are also others, a group of designers who realized that design is much more than trying to find solutions to problems or finding like glossy or designing glossy chairs and table. Design could draw people to asking questions by making artifacts that make them think. So here the image you have in the background is a project that Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby did in the mid-90s. And they observed, because they're good designers, they observed the world around them. They observed that a lot of people in the mid-90s started using mobile phones, technologies, and this was a bit disruptive to them. It was a lot of communication that could be that could disrupt their way of life. And they designed this object called the Faraday chair. It's a sort of bigger than a chair, but it's a device where you can go in and there's a Faraday cage. Faraday cage is a device that stops certain electromagnetic waves. So it means that when you want to relax and you don't want to be disturbed by the phone, you go in there, and even if you have your phone, it wouldn't work. And of course, this was very interesting at the time because we had not many people had mobile phones compared to nowadays. And this, I mean, we'll probably see this as a product that could exist nowadays. So to some extent, they did not predict the future, but they created a certain kind of debate about constant connectivity in the mid-90s by creating an object that everyone could understand. It was generally showed in cultural centers and art and design museums. So all of those things were ancestors. And I do think it's not necessarily strange that there's a renewed interest in those kind of tactics and approaches in the last 10 years. If you look at, I mean, both anthropology on the left part, it's a book by Marc Auger called "Where Did the Future Go?" and in business circles and in historian circles, in sociologist circles, there's been a lot of discussions about what happened with the future, what happened with our glossy representation of the future that we had probably 100 years ago about the year 2000. And nowadays, it's as if we were stuck in some kind of constant present with some difficulties in imagining like different scenarios. Or if there's a scenario, it's about environmental collapse, or it's about like infinite progress. And it doesn't work this way. It's problematic. So I would say that there's some kind of sort of renewed interest in methods, approaches, discussions about getting out of our like infinite present that we seem to be stuck in. And this is one of the reasons probably groups like us or other design studios are working with speculative design and design fiction approaches to, well, help rebuild some kind of expertise or knowledge and possibilities about discussion concerning tomorrow. So a few words about the logic behind that. I mean, beyond like these ancestors that I presented, and beyond like this moment in the last 10 years that in which we saw renewed interest in like projecting ourselves tomorrow, the logic behind design fiction or speculative design in general is it's quite important to state that the future hasn't happened yet. And it's one of the reasons that it's a moving target. It's plural. There's not just one possible future. Even though when you read certain magazines, they say that, yeah, the future is going to be this way. We're going to have like AI or self-driving vehicles. It's just a very abstract concept. There are many ways those things can exist, not exist, or exist in different ways. And what we do think is important with the design fiction is that it's a way to help us as a society discuss and understand how those future can materialize, and in retrospect, to act today if we want them to happen or if we want to avoid them happening, because it could be problematic for us, for environment, or in general. As I said, the future is a moving target, so there's no way to observe the future, even though I used that term before. But if you look at how science fiction writers work, there's a way to talk about the future. There's a way to not anticipate, but try to build scenarios that create a discussion about the future. And here you have William Gibson, who's a very prominent American science fiction writer, who wrote books in the 80s in the trend called cyberpunk, that somehow, I mean, was so influent for people using the internet that they used the term cyberspace, that he coined. That's the person who coined the term cyberspace. And he basically said, and that's, I think, is a good lesson for this talk, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. What it means practically is that the changes we'll have in the future, in the next 5-10 years, they already exist. There's already behaviors, technologies, social behaviors, attitudes that exist at a really like limited levels that may be amplified for different reasons. And the role of the role of what we do, and in general when we try to, let's say, observe the future, is to understand those signals of the future, things that do not necessarily fit in the way we think about the world, things that seems a little bit strange, but that could probably become something important. So here are some examples that I picked just to for the sake of illustrating this. Some of them are quite funny, the way human beings adopt new gestures, new postures with technologies. Like if you see the legs of the daughter of one of my friends using her legs to use an iPad, which is completely strange the first time you see that. I don't necessarily mean that the future is going to be like this, but it means certainly in terms of anthropological perspective that there are new ways that our body adapts or appropriate technologies. The Faraday chair on the top right-hand corner, I mentioned that as probably a signal of the future in the mid-90s, of course. Nowadays, this is more like something that actually exists. If you go to certain places where you could watch a movie and there's no possibilities to use your phone. Example at the bottom is those kids using masks. It's an image that I remember. I collected that image probably 5 years ago, looking at like websites in China. At the time, it felt a bit shocking. Like, wow, they would put like masks like this on kids. It feels like a bit depressing. And I mean, given the situation that we had in the last few months, I mean, I do think at the time, looking at this kind of signal prepared me mentally to understand that this was a possibility that could exist in the future more generally. So let's say those examples are not just signals of possibilities, they're ways to stimulate understanding about how things could change in society. And the image on the right is it's a wedding in a video game called World of Warcraft. For those who play World of Warcraft or those massive multiplayer games, you know that. But for the others, you do not necessarily know that certain rituals like weddings, sometimes burials, happen in video games because of the communities that group there that cannot necessarily go physically to the wedding or the different ceremonies. So rituals have extended their presence in the virtual world. And as you can imagine, what we saw in the last few months with the confinement, the lockdown, is certainly, I mean, we saw this happening, especially sadly, with ceremonies for people who vanished from this planet. So what I mean here is that by looking at those like practices that are not necessarily standard, like over time, you build some kind of understanding about new possibilities. And the point of building this design fiction is just simply to use this kind of mindset of tuning your perspective and noticing those different signals. And when the time comes to extrapolate from them, extrapolating means asking the question like, what if this signal that I presented before became more common? What would happen practically? What would that mean? So if Faraday chairs were more important, what would that mean? If we had more religious rituals in virtual worlds, what would that mean? And to do that, it doesn't mean necessarily that I or in the people doing this exercise are in favor of this to happening. I'm not necessarily in favor of all of that, but it's a way to make that scenario about the future more tangible, to discuss it practically. And the next step is, of course, to find a format. Could be a map, could be like a newspaper, could be a catalog, could be a fictional TED video, could be, I mean, an unboxing videos. That's a format we like doing as well. It's when it's all those videos you have on YouTube where people have a product, they open the box and they comment it. It's a very interesting format to express a scenario about the future as well. So extrapolating is asking this what if question and finding a proper format to illustrate it. And one ingredient that is important to generate a good debate about the desirability, the relevance, the opportunities of the scenario is what my colleague Nick Foster called the future mundane. In our case at the Near Future Laboratory, what we are interested in is showing like scenarios about the future in the most banal or mundane way as possible. And the reason for doing so is that it helps people to get a grasp, to understand those changes. And a good ingredient for this is showing problems. Like we follow this quote by a science fiction writer called Frédéric Paul, who said, a good science fiction story should be able to predict not the automobile, but a traffic jam. So what we're interested in every time we work on projects, like for instance, about AI, artificial intelligence, self-driving vehicles, about the streets of tomorrow, it's a project we're working on nowadays, is to think about frictions, problems that, not because that we want to be dystopian and pessimistic, but we want people to react and adjust their perspective and propose solutions about how things could be done better. So probably to conclude and to show you how this can exist in the context of museum, I'm going to show you quickly a project we did with two cultural institutions, the National Football Museum in Manchester and the Center for Contemporary Culture in Barcelona. There was a joint exhibit about data, big data, the data collected by machines and like phones, sensors. It was in 2015, big exhibit about that and how it might have an influence in the context of sports. So what we did was to, well, of course, collect all those different signals about possibilities, about AI, sensors, big data that I discussed. And we created like a fictional newspaper about like the sports part of the newspaper that would, each of the page would give some kind of scenario about how those technologies may have an influence on sport reporting. For instance, there's a person on the right there saying that it could be possible to simulate the first 4 rounds of the national and league cups. There are advertisement at the bottom about genetic testing for your kids to see if the kid is an athlete, etc., etc. So this was, you can see that as sort of provocations, little provocations illustrated by how it could be dealt with in the context of a sport newspaper. And of course, as it was distributed in those cities, people could read them, could realize that like their favorite teams might have lost in certain game, and see how new elements like information visualization, graphics, diagrams using new kinds of data could exist, and they could debate whether this is like they could wish this happen or not, whether this would be weird in the context of sports, whether this would reshape their understanding of what they like in terms of sport. So you can see that as a sort of vehicle to engage those people in a discussion about sport and how sport might be changed by certain technologies. And so probably it's not necessarily desirable, or probably some changes are relevant. So if I had to conclude, the term design fiction that I use is basically, you can see that as an exercise of imagination. It's just a way to create some sort of intermediary vehicle, catalogs, fictional newspapers, maps, short videos, just a way to characterize how the future could be in order to consider the implications, the consequences, whether it's desirable, whether it's problematic, whether it's relevant for society. And our point is definitely not to do this exercise of imagination to create new applications. I mean, I'm not interested in creating new applications. I'm interested in creating the conditions of a certain public debate about those scenarios. And the point of using those very material and basic formats is that it makes them understandable to the people we work with. And in general, we leave that afterwards. I mean, the maps, the catalog we show, it's just an intermediary vehicle to foster this discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Nicolas, thank you so much. And I'm sure there's a virtual sort of round of applause in different bedrooms and offices all around the world right now. And I'll tell you what, if you could see me now, I would kill for a Faraday cage.
Okay.
I have so many technical things all around. Now, we've got about 10 minutes for questions, and we actually have quite a few coming in. But before we get to them, we also have some lovely comments, particularly one from Terry, who is part of our community, who thinks that you could easily design one of our exhibitions, as this process seems so similar to what we would use in our museums and science centres. So you might have some job opportunities coming your way soon. But I'm going to bring up Dorothy, who I believe will have our very first question. Whilst we're bringing her up, do remember to please put your questions in the Ask a Question box below, and you can vote up the one you really want to be answered. But Dorothy, what's that first question?
Yes, we have a lot of questions. The first one, we have the question from Barbara Strescher, telling how diverse are the groups invited to design the future?
That's a quite important question indeed, because most of the time, I mean, as you can imagine, it's people from wealthy Western countries who work on that. So I would say there's no general answer. It depends on the project that we do. In general, as I said, there are two phases. The first phase is about like understanding potential signals of the future, and the second phase is about like building together scenarios. So in those two phases, there are ways to maximize, so to say, the diversity issue. For instance, let's take a concrete project. We're currently working with the city of Lyon in France about the streets of tomorrow. And the point of the project is to create similar kind of scenarios. But what we do is to make a series of, like, let's call them expert interviews in different countries, in Mexico, in Morocco, in South America, in India, so that we have other perspectives to use them as kind of stimuli scenarios. So that's one thing. or it could be also field visits, field places where we have participants that are not like the standard kind of perspective. And of course, that would be not interesting for us if it were really standard. And in the second phase, in general, when we do have like a workshop where we build scenarios together, it's quite important to try also to maximize the diversity in terms of having different profiles, different genders, different people coming from different cultures. And that could be problematic because, of course, there are language barriers and language issues, but there are ways to circumvent those issues by trying to repeat those workshops in different contexts and make them more inclusive and participative.
I'm going to push a little bit more on that point, Nicolas, if that's okay. We have a really great question from Nari Blackenberg, and she wants to know not just about the diversity of group, how do future scenarios incorporate non-Western knowledge systems and Black futures?
Very important question as well. I mean, I would say that in the groups we are all quite passionate about like alternative perspectives, mostly because the way we are. I mean, the type of client we work with, if they were to work with like more standard kind of perspective, they wouldn't go to us. So in general, they come to us because they want to be surprised. So we try to maximize also this kind of like other sorts of perspective. The trick is that sometimes it's not just related to like Afrofuturism and examples like that. It's just there's always a communication problems when we show the signals of the future to the clients we work with. If it's too weird and disruptive, they would be like, yeah, but this does not fit with our context. And our role is to say, yeah, but probably the future might change. And I'm personally, I'm super interested. I've been super interested recently in the role of trash and rubbish, and especially in the context of digital technologies. And every time I bring this to the table with Western clients, they say things like, "Oh no, this we recycle. There's no problem about that." While myself, I go on the street and I see like plenty of digital trash that could be a problem, but that could be also an opportunity to create scenarios about recycling opportunities. So the point is, and here is an example that I have in my context, but in the context, for instance, about, I picked this example because there's a work of a South African artist called François Knote, who works specifically on digital trash, and that I always show to the client in the context of the project we do. And it seems also quite far-fetched, but what we do in general is that we never have just one scenario. We have multiple scenarios, and some of them in foresight circles, we call that the wild cards. They are the ones which are a little bit more surprising, that we have to put absolutely to disrupt the perspective, because in general, the status quo is not, it's not really useful. And it's by looking at non-Western perspective, especially about new ways of thinking about our relationship to the environment, to non-humans, that this disruption can happen.
There's been actually a lovely comment in the chat, which you probably can't see, Nicolas, but again, it's from Nairi, and it's more of a comment that the West, not only the originators of design fiction around the world, different cultures, epistemologies have embraced future fictions for centuries. Writers, designers, artists from the global South have been and are active in this field. The future is black-brown, which I think is a really lovely statement.
Yeah.
Dorothy, do you want to go to our next main question?
Yes, with pleasure. We have a question from Ursula. She asks, could you identify trends or major difference in how different professionals or groups, for instance, writers, designers, anthropologists, or philosophers, envision future, Nicolas?
Yeah. It's probably also related to the comment that Brad read just before. I mean, there's a sort of anthropological, probably almost universal ways of seeing, of sensing and seeing the world as human beings that relies on creating stories that make sense of our existence. So there's a lot of common traits. But what I do find interesting in what I mentioned here is that probably, even though there are collaboration between anthropologists, designers, writers, poets, the the thing that I find interesting with designers and architects in the way they like work with this kind of scenarios is the importance of materiality. By picking a certain kind of format, by using matter, and of course, poets and writers use a different matter, and people doing movies use different material as well. But each of those, the relationship with the different matter, whether it's about writing, whether it's about creating a video, whether it's about crafting an object like the Faraday chair, makes this probably a similar topic observed by different perspectives that can engage people in a way that could be different, that could be fruitful and engaging in the way to have a more nuanced discourse about this. And I certainly don't want to say that design fiction should be like the solution. I mean, I read plenty of books and I like movies, but it's the combination of all of those things that helps to, I mean, be more nuanced than saying, yeah, the future is about AI, or yeah, the future is about digital trash. That's not enough.
Nicolas, we've got time for one more question, and I think the answer is going to have to be super short.
Okay.
Are future museums critical enough? Are they more like speculative design or world fairs?
The usual answer for this is it depends. But I would say there's a good opportunity to include that kind of perspective, not just in science communication, but also probably in having some kind of interdisciplinary perspective about that can give critique, but also a constructive reading about opportunities and risks about change.
Okay, it looks like we are out of time for questions now. I want to thank once again Nicolas Nova for his brilliant keynote and the Kavli Foundation for making this possible. You will see a poll appear right now to tell us what you thought of the session. Please make a minute to let us know. And we are now going to have a 30 minutes break. Please use the app during the break to find peers to meet up for coffee. And actually, Brad, tell me what meetups can you see are happening?
Absolutely, Dorothy. People are using that app, which is really amazing. And there are so many meetups happening right now. So there's one about equity at Ecsite, which has obviously been a big conversation in this keynote. Yeah. There's one on audience research in a pandemic. There are two about sort of making as well. So if you're interested in those, go to the app, go to the meetup section, and it's the most simplest thing you can do to join. Now, coming up at 12 sharp, and that's Central European time, we have a very special someone from Ljubljana leading the next session. So see you very soon.
Bye, see you soon.